That one short message arrived like a verdict slipped under the wrong door. Do not come. I read it in a warm bathtub while steam curled up and the room felt suddenly thin. The water cooled around my knees and my hands trembled in a way I had never felt before, not the small tremble of nerves, but the hollow vibration of someone who realizes she has been counted out of her own life. For years I had been the quiet bank of our family, extra shifts, loan cosigns, late-night repairs, the soft hand that kept a home from unraveling. The mortgage statement with my name on it sat in my desk like a quiet contract of love. That morning, staring at zeros and due dates, I decided to stop being invisible currency. If my son could tell me I wasn't welcome at Christmas, then he could feel the absence I had been carrying. My name is Claire Benton. I baked pies for a living and kept ledgers to make sure the lights stayed on. For 26 years I raised Michael, scraped knees, science fair triumphs, late-night essays, and the small domestic rituals that stitch a life together. When his father died, our household narrowed into a rope that tied the two of us close. I worked more. I learned accounting terms. I co-signed what was needed. It never occurred to me to see that co-signing a mortgage was anything but a promise. Christmas was the soft center of my year. Trees, paper stars, a crooked sonnet my son insisted I keep, and the smell of cinnamon. Those rituals are memory anchors. I expected them to hold us steady even as things frayed at the edges. But the months before that last holiday felt like slow erosion. Small things missed. Birthdays, a dashed promise, an explanation that kept getting thinner. Jane, Michael's wife, worked long hours and had a brisk practicality that sometimes left me feeling like the sentimental one in a house that had no patience for sentiment. I told myself to breathe, to tolerate the small cuts, because love requires endurance and because my instinct was always to smooth things out. When the text arrived short, calm, practical, I read it twice, hoping it would soften. It did not. They wanted a quiet holiday, they said, a small family. Please don't come. The message was not cruel in tone, only decisive. The punishment wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary and final. In that quiet, I realized I had been assumed to their life in a way that let gratitude evaporate into expectation. My name on the mortgage had become a secret instrument of their comfort. I started to look at the mortgage differently, not as a generous act, but as unnoticed leverage that had never been acknowledged. I am not dramatic by nature. I do not enact thunderbolts in kitchens. But the muscles of indignation, long dormant from years of putting others first, woke. I moved from shock to planning in a slow, deliberate way, would not act in a fit of fury. I would act with the calm of someone accustomed to counting and deciding. If being told not to come meant that my presence was no longer valued, I would translate my invisible contributions into visible consequences. The decision to stop making voluntary mortgage payments was not sudden theater. It was the arithmetic that matched the emotional ledger of being excluded. I began quietly. I called my attorney and framed questions as hypotheticals. I asked about rights and exposure. I listened and took notes like a woman who had spent decades balancing budgets and emotions. The lawyer explained the range of outcomes, the mechanics of voluntary withdrawal, the toll it would take on credit, and the technical exposure I might carry. I thanked her and kept breathing. This was not about revenge, but about recalibration. Meanwhile, I gathered proof of what I had already done: bank transfers, contractor receipts, emailed offers of help, the small donations and repairs that had kept their house functioning when funds were low. I made copies, cataloged dates, and built a folder that read like a ledger of love. I did not tell Michael. I wanted the action to be a lesson in awareness, not a spectacle. I mailed a plain certified letter giving notice that I would cease my voluntary mortgage contributions at the next billing cycle. The letter used no indulgent language, no flourish, only the hard geometry of ledger dates and amounts. When the first transfer failed and a notice arrived, I felt the small, bureaucratic sting: automated phone calls, bank emails, the inevitable late fee. Michael's response was swift, indignation that read like entitlement. He called once and left a terse message asking to talk. He arrived a few days later with Jane. They stood in my small kitchen, the place that had once been the center of every holiday, and the room suddenly felt too small for what we were about to do to each other. Michael's voice was practiced. He explained why excluding me from Christmas was their decision about building their own rhythm. He didn't use cool words, only pragmatic ones, but his practicality felt like a dismissal. I recited receipts. I listed the nights when I had wired money for repairs, the weekends spent patching a roof, the tuition checks sent when their account was low. I read the ledger like evidence and did not weep because accounting has a certain stern mercy. It makes the invisible visible. Lily, their little girl, hovered at the edge of a dispute she scarcely understood. She wanted the gingerbread, the tree, the soft rituals. Her smallness threw the conflict into relief. This was not merely a line-item argument, but a human story with a child in the middle. For a moment, Michael's anger flickered. Then the old rationales returned. I'd been the bank and thus owed continued benevolence. He could not imagine that a mother would choose to withhold comfort to make a point. Bank notices escalated. Late fees and default warnings bloomed like small red flowers in the mail. The mortgage servicer called. A timeline of missed payments opened into a new ledger. Yet the house stood indifferent to emotional calculus. Neighbors watched and the small local paper caught the scent of family friction. A headline arrived like a rumor. Mother stops payments, son shocked. The story flattened nuance, but it also pulled threads loose. Unexpectedly, those threads formed a net that lifted rather than sank. Local vendors I had quietly helped over the years, the contractor who had been paid in cash when their joint account was low, the teacher whose student I had quietly supported started adding small voices. They remembered anonymous checks, favors done with no desire for recognition. The community's memory of my unseen labor punctured the tidy narrative that the payments were spiteful. At the same time, I watched how the pressure reshaped Michael. Legal counsel entered the house with its calm vocabulary of consequences. He was scared in ways he had not anticipated. The practical implications of missed payments had reached him in digits as well as in shame. The lawyer negotiated options, the bank offered mediation, and neighbors who had once been polite in distance leaned into a kind of public witness. The fight had moved from private humiliation to civic accountability. What cut deepest, though, came in small domestic moments. Lily once pressed a glitter card into my hand and asked me to come back at Christmas so she did not have to have a silent tree. Her face, earnest and puzzled, underlined everything. Parents do not teach children to exclude. They teach them to include. The ledger I had created with withheld payments was not the point. The point was to recenter gratitude and visibility. The financial notices became an official conversation when the bank representative asked for a meeting. The word foreclosure tasted like a mathematical nightmare. I sat at the kitchen table and felt the room tilt under a new gravity. I had meant the action to educate. I had not wanted the house to be sold. I had not wanted my granddaughter to stand without a roof. But the principle was stubborn. Assumptions without acknowledgement had a cost. I understood that if I pulled back entirely, we might all pay a price none of us wanted. At dawn one winter morning, Michael arrived at my door looking worn beyond his years. He had not slept. His jaw was set in that particular way people adopt when they have been fighting with themselves. He said, simply and without the practiced armor of the prior weeks, that I had broken him. The way he said the word made it both plea and accusation. He had called his lawyer, he had called the bank, but the machinery of consequences moved at its own pace. He did not yet understand that my choice had been an accounting of my dignity as much as a financial decision. We went to the bank together. The meeting smelled like recycled air and bureaucratic patience. I placed copies of receipts and proof of payments I had made over years on the table. Michael's face tightened when he realized that the kindnesses he had assumed were not free. The bank offered mediation. They wanted a practical solution that would avoid the radical act of foreclosure. The legal instruments offered restructuring, a formal acknowledgement of what I had provided, a repayment plan, and a new written agreement for future contributions. The mediation was not a victory lap. It was a sober reinventory of debts and intentions. The story left our house and landed in the town hall in a way neither of us predicted. At a civic meeting intended for neighborly grievances, voices rose to tell small, unseen stories. A contractor I had hired for little cash during a slow year said he had been helped when a roof needed mending. A teacher mentioned a tuition check that had not been connected to my name publicly until the ledger surfaced. People began confiding small acts of reciprocity. The public memory of my invisible work assembled into a record. The crucial moment was not in a lawyer's file, but in a child's small hand. Lily, having absorbed the tension like a sponge, handed me a glittered sonnet and insisted we have a tree together. Her plea dislodged the final sediment of hardened entitlement. Michael, confronted by neighbors' testimonies and the sight of his daughter tugging at the edges of adult stubbornness, softened. He saw at last that the person he had asked not to come to Christmas had been a steady force holding the structure that allowed him to host a holiday at all. The mediation concluded with a formalized agreement that honored the truth. My past contributions were acknowledged on paper. A repayment plan designed to be fair was drawn. Future payments would be transparent and the house would remain. Michael agreed to public acknowledgement of my help and to the task of paying forward rather than assuming ongoing subsidy. The bank withdrew the threat of foreclosure conditioned on adherence to the mediated plan. The community's quiet testimony had shifted the legal calculus because moral witness sometimes bends dry accounting. We did not have a cinematic reconciliation. There were no sweeping embraces that erased years of pattern. Instead, there were small, awkward apologies, a formal signing of documents, and the clumsy first attempts at new habits. Michael said thank you in a voice relieved of entitlement. Jane allowed herself a modest smile. We sat around the table with Lily and made gingerbread that week. The house stayed. Yet the lesson went deeper. I had not wanted to be cruel. I had wanted visibility. Withholding payments had been an instrument of truth, a way to show that invisible labor is not limitless. My act had forced a public accounting of small kindnesses that had been folded into expectation. It taught my son to acknowledge help, to practice reciprocity, and to see a parent as a person rather than a resource. A year later, our Christmas was quieter but more intentional. Michael invited me early and asked that I sit with him while they wrapped gifts. He called weeks ahead to plan. He did not assume my labor. The mortgage continued under the new agreement, transparent and recorded. He paid more willingly, not because he was forced by threats, but because a ledger had turned his abstract obligations into visible acts he could meet. Lily still idolized sugar and glitter, but she also learned that apologies can be a practice, not a single act. I learned my limits. I still baked on Tuesday mornings and taught a community budgeting class on Thursdays. I painted with colors I had set aside for later. The small card Lily made for Mom, thank you, sat in my apron pocket for months. It was the quiet benediction that made the whole harsh calculus worth it. People will judge the choice to withhold. Some will call it cruel, others say it is pragmatic. I accept judgments. But after a text that said do not come after being reduced to an assumed amenity, I found that translating invisible labor into visible responsibility changed the family's architecture. The house stayed because we chose a new way, not because I silently held it up alone anymore. Sometimes families need a seismic wake to remember their structure. Sometimes it is a withheld mortgage, sometimes a conversation, sometimes a slow-lit ledger. For our family, it was the mortgage that taught gratitude to grow teeth. For me, it was the lesson that love can be fierce and lean and expectant of mutual care. I chose peace over sacrifice, and in the quiet that followed, I found the gentleness I'd always wanted to be able to give to myself.